Hi everyone, I'm Nadita Gupta and welcome to the Shakti Collective. And today we have with us Devon. Devon, would you please introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Devon Persing, and I'm currently an accessibility specialist at Shopify.
That is awesome. And so we're very excited to have you here and your story. And so how would you describe accessibility in 3 words?
So my very optimistic 3 words are inclusive, holistic, and people first. That's kind of 2 words, but
I
people
love that.
first being one
I love that.
thing together. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll count people first as one. That's one word.
Excellent.
And so why do you care about accessibility?
So my kind of first career was in library science. When I was pretty young, I started working in libraries, and then I ended up going to library school and did that more formally. And so that work was really all built around information services and just helping people find the stuff they needed to do whatever it is they want to do. So when I started doing more technical sort of digital work in libraries, I just kind of carried that through. So I think my interest in accessibility kind of came out of the assumption that it was just part of what information work involved, and then kind of went down that path more deeply as I kind of switched to working in digital spaces full time.
Oh wow, okay. And so between your experiences that you've had, what was your first aha moment about accessibility?
I think my first kind of building on the first bit, I think my first aha moment was really realizing that accessibility wasn't something that was kind of part of mainstream UX. This was in the early 2000s, so like WCAG was still very new. People weren't really talking a lot about digital accessibility or web accessibility. And so I was approaching, making digital experiences or physical, learning experiences accessible just because that was part of, my kind of experience and kind of work as an information professional. So it was kind of when I started doing more digital first work, and especially when I moved out of libraries and started working in more mainstream tech, that I realized like, oh, this is not really a thing that everyone's thinking about. That's weird. And partly I think it was because the systems I was working on were very lightweight and were very flexible and were really meant to be very adaptable. So I wasn't doing a lot of like heavy web app type work. So I think it took me moving into kind of more mainstream tech to realize like, oh, this is not a thing that everyone was just doing and thinking about from the get-go.
Wow. Yes, and that's so true. Like I completely relate to that and I can see that as well. And so as you've learned, in your career, during the course of your career, can you tell us about someone who's had an influence on your accessibility professional career? What kind of lessons did this person teach you?
So the person I completely chalk up my doing this full time now is my old manager, Bill Norwal, who co-founded and was my manager at an agency here in Seattle called Founder Interactive, which is still around. He was really the first person that helped me take that kind of interest I had in accessibility and focus on it full time in technical work. So they hired me as a developer. I was doing some general dev and UX work, and I was bringing up things that were kind of bothering me around accessibility with either designs we would get or different aspects of projects. And he luckily had some background in doing some accessibility work, and we ended up having a client that needed some accessibility focused work. And so he really coached me through getting up to speed on taking that knowledge I already had and applying it to a more kind of robust web appy type experience. So I had a lot of catching up to do as far as learning sort of web dev techniques and kind of how those would actually work in an accessible way. But I was able to kind of have the space and time to do that with him as a mentor, which was really, really great.
That's wonderful. That's really wonderful. And so thinking about what you do today and how you got here, what really keeps you inspired to keep working in accessibility?
there's just a lot more work to do, which is, I don't know if that's inspiring or depressing, but it's kind of the idea that there's just so like accessibility is so behind in physical and digital spaces, and there's just so much work to do, and there's so much you can get out of even just seeing small steps forward, even though sometimes those small steps are really, really frustrating, but there's just so much to do. And yeah, I feel like it's just kind of something I'll keep doing in some capacity forever, because there's so much stuff to do, you know?
For sure. And so, as you're thinking about all of that, right? Like, oh my gosh, I got to keep pushing the needle forward, keep working in this field. How have you made an impact in this field? What are you currently working on? What does your day-to-day look like?
So my current work is kind of, I guess, program level work. What I mostly do at this point is, well, I function as an internal accessibility specialist in a product company. So I don't work with any particular product teams right now. I'm kind of doing high level, not quite policy, but a lot of training, a lot of educating, not just people doing dev or design work, but also working with directors, working with executives, working with managers, and trying to figure out how do we scale this thing. So a lot of what I do is not necessarily accessibility work day to day, but kind of trying to communicate and build out an accessibility culture, which is not what I originally ever imagined I'd be doing. I thought I'd just be sitting and testing all day. But yeah, so it was kind of, so I feel like the biggest impact, the stuff I'm doing right now that's really valuable, or at least what I hope is really valuable, is education and kind of getting people to think about not just kind of the nuts and bolts of like, how do I make this web page accessible, but really thinking about, why haven't we been thinking about this before? What are the things that we culturally need to change to make this just part of our work? That kind of stuff. Those are the kind of difficult questions I'm currently trying to solve.
And that's so fascinating. And so, thinking about, it's almost like you're advocating for accessibility, not just in your team, but even in your organization, right? So how do you really build support for accessibility in your organization? What are some ways that have worked, maybe that have not worked as well?
The biggest thing is patience, which is very difficult for me. I think that the first time I kind of did this being kind of building out an accessibility program was as a consultant, working for a very long-term, like a year and a half, almost 2-year contract with a client. And that was with kind of very direct, like, this is your goal. My current job, that wasn't really the original goal. The original goal was that I would work in the design system. And then it kind of ballooned. So I've been trying to take what I learned from that experience of kind of having the direct goal of building out an accessibility program and trying to figure out how to adapt that in my current space. So a lot of what I do is trying to share the same messaging in as many different ways as I can, and trying to figure out things that, some people like data, some people want user stories, like they want to see video, they want to see usability studies. Some people want to get down into the technical leads. So a lot of it is taking my instructional design background from working in libraries and my research background, and trying to figure out how to kind of plant those seeds and help people do a lot of that thinking on their own, because they have to kind of make those connections themselves for it to really stick. So it's a lot of trying to figure out as many ways as possible to get people to think about it until it's unavoidable.
No, yeah, that makes sense.
It's a lot of training materials. It's a lot of like, not hand-holding, but trying to figure out the different ways that different people learn and different people kind of process different types of information.
Right. And like what engages one person may not engage someone else, right? So you just kind of figure that out. And so
exactly.
And so as you've learned and figured that out, so what experiences have been beneficial to you especially for your current role, but just, within accessibility for gaining that experience? Like, what were some of those experiences that were helpful?
So I mentioned the library and science background a lot. And I think when I was kind of coming up as a quote unquote, I guess, web generalist, UX was a thing, but the bigger thing was HCI, or human computer interaction. So it was really about teaching people how to use and studying how people use computers and less about making things easier for them. So that's been very nice to kind of see that switch. But I think coming up in that kind of way of thinking has made me consider things from a kind of scaffolding perspective. So a lot of my background and training was in information architecture, definitely visual in any way. I'm not a visual designer, but I have done IA work. I've done a lot of research and learning about how people do search and how people browse, how people use web interfaces and digital interfaces. I have a lot of background in like semantic markup because I at one point was writing code to publish journal articles from XML to HTML. So like
Nice.
a lot of those kind of quote unquote boring sort of early web and very library skills have really come in helpful. So I find that those are the things that I think have given me that kind of underlying context for all the kind of like crunchy things that kind of trip people up when they're learning about accessibility, because often people will be like, oh, well, I know that I'm supposed to worry about the keyboard, but like, how do I know if I should use your link or button? Or, what does this list item type actually do? Or why should I use one particular type of element or the other? And I'm not learning about HTML because I studied React and then have figured out, oh, React outputs HTML. I learned HTML first. Like I was writing HTML before CSS worked. So that, not for very long, but for a while. So I think I have that kind of structure-y semantic background and just kind of formal education in how people use computers in a way that has been extremely helpful. The thing I've really have been having to focus on learning more about is the usability side and the like, how do people actually do stuff in the wild side, which is very interesting to me. But that's been easier to adapt to than I think the other way, where I have to learn that kind of nitty-gritty stuff, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. And so from the things you've learned, within your career in accessibility, what was something that you learned that surprised you?
I think the biggest thing has been that sort of more recent piece, getting more into research and usability, both while working agencies and now, is how much I've learned about, well, I guess the current push to sort of get a better handle on cognitive disability and how that impacts technology use, because that is so varied and so kind of feels much squishier than some of the more technical, like, the semantic markup is correct, then a screen reader user should hopefully be able to use it. Even things like thinking about people using assistive tech in ways that it maybe wasn't originally designed for, or really getting into that kind of day-to-day of how people are actually using technology is very scary in some ways, because it makes accessibility, I think, feel even harder, because then people start to realize, oh, this is a usability problem. This isn't like a cut and dry technical problem. So for me, that's been really exciting, because it feels less rote and less like I'm giving people checklists. But it also means that is, I think the part of it that surprised me the most is how much I've also seen that kind of realization kind of help people who are practitioners or people who are trying to get into it realize how broad the impact is. It's not, a very small number of people, it's a lot of people. And helping people think more broadly about what disability means what accessibility means, I think has been really valuable. And I think that I'm hoping that that continues to kind of shift that kind of squishier direction, which is a person who really likes organizing things and really likes structuring things. Wanting it to
Right.
get squishier is kind of scary, but good. So I think for that's the things that's kind of surprised me the most is that I've gotten more kind of in touch with that side of my way of thinking.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very cool. And so thinking about your proudest accomplishment in accessibility, if you had to pick one, because I'm sure you've done amazing things. If you had to pick one, what would you say your proudest accomplishment in accessibility was for you?
So the thing that I think about when I am having a really bad day and when I feel like this is, just pushing a giant rock up a hill forever. A coworker of mine who I used to once told me that so I had done a workshop for our team, a bunch of workshops, but one in particular was about cognitive disability and examples of learning disabilities, examples of different types of things that impact how people cognitively access digital information. And he realized from that workshop that his girlfriend, who had been told, growing up that she wasn't smart, that she was lazy, etc., probably was dyslexic. And she went and got tested, and it turned out she was dyslexic. And so she'd been able to find all these tools and find all these adaptations and different ways of thinking about herself that had not been on her radar before. So that is one of the things I think about when I'm like, ugh, I just want to rest. This is too much. That just sort of like, it changes people's lives. And I've watched that kind of happen where people are like, oh, I didn't realize that the way I think about this or do this isn't quote unquote normal. Could I be in this bucket of people? So that's for me the most valuable thing is seeing people have that personal connection and hopefully learning something that actually helps them as a person, in addition to like helping them make better experiences for other people.
And so those are basically your proud moments when you've seen the things you've done really affect people that way. And so
yeah,
I guess we keep pushing the needle for those days.
yeah. And it's so much of this work takes so long, especially if you're doing program level work and not doing feature or product level work, that those types of moments I feel like are really impactful when you're not seeing really obvious technological change really quickly.
No, for sure, for sure. And so, thinking about product level versus process level, right? I think one question that comes to mind is, what's the difference between inclusive design and accessibility for you?
I thought about this one really hard. So for me, I think of inclusive design as an activity. It's something you do. It's a choice you make when you're making design decisions, whether it's literal visual or physical design or like code design, like all those different things. And I think accessibility it's kind of a facet of that, but I feel like it's a requirement. Like I feel like it's tricky because I feel like accessibility is a requirement for inclusive design. It's almost a checkbox in that sense, but it's obviously not a checkbox. It's a lot of different things. So I feel like inclusive design isn't inclusive without accessibility, but accessibility is its own kind of requirement or discipline within that concept. So I thought about this a lot. I didn't say I had a good answer, but that's where I currently am thinking about that.
No, for sure. Again, it's how you would look at that. So thinking about, different experiences you've had, what was the most frustrating thing that you have faced in your career within accessibility?
I think back when I was a consultant, I did all sorts of different projects. I worked with a couple different agencies. And I think the most frustrating thing would be when we would go into an organization, they'd maybe hire us to like run a training session or do a sample audit of their product. And we would do that work, and then they would decide that accessibility work was quote unquote too expensive. And there was never time to unpack that with them because I think that comes from a very deep misunderstanding about what accessibility actually means, what's involved in making it sustainable, who all is affected, and it's tied up in ableism in ways that when that's the kind of level of interaction, it's impossible to get into that depth of like the shades of gray of all of it. So the sort of upfront no, I think, is really frustrating. And I think I think it's the biggest thing. I think it's the upfront kind of like, oh, this sounds hard and expensive. We're not going to do it right now. Maybe we'll do it. Because it's very difficult to then get them to realize why that's not even a good way to think about it.
How do you deal with that? Because, I've faced similar frustrations, and I'm sure this is not going to be the last one. So, sometimes you just have to take the deep breath, like, okay, deep breath, I got this, I'm going to figure this out. What are some ways in which you deal with that? What are some ways in which you keep going? What helps?
I think I feel like there's always like the one person that shows up in that workshop, or the one person who takes that information away from that audit that was really engaged or is continuing to be really engaged, and the hope that they're going to run with it, with that new information they have, whether it's there or if they, jump ship and go work someplace else. The hope that they're going to take that kind of seed with them. It's the same as like when people go to meetups or go to conferences or see a talk online or whatever. It's like, I always try to feed in those sort of intro level concepts in whatever way I can, so that even if they don't forget any of the nitty gritty stuff or the really detailed stuff, they're going to at least be like, oh, this is something I need to worry about and I want to learn more about it. And I need to figure out how to do it. It's that kind of just getting people aware of I don't want to say complexity because that makes it sound scary, but just people realizing how much they don't know, and hoping that they then want to learn more, and that they're not turned off from it. Right. So that kind of like hoping that I've planted some seeds here and there, and that someone eventually will figure out the best way to plant and take care of that plant, to continue my not great metaphor, but yeah, that kind of hope that other people will take that torch.
Right, absolutely. And so thinking about, you touched on your experience with working with a consultancy, right? And then now you're almost like an internal consultant. So you're actually embedded in an actual company. So what's different? Because I've heard so many different things, right? About whether you're a only accessibility person on a team, or whether, like you said, you're a consultant and you're working with another team. So what's different about working as in a dedicated accessibility team versus maybe some other teams that you worked with? What are some differences in that?
I think the biggest thing is, I think you really hit the nail on the head when you said I'm kind of an internal consultant, and I think that's the biggest difference, because I'm not working on a specific product or a specific kind of set of products. So I'm not the person usually who's sitting and testing something or working directly with devs or designers. Things I have done are write templates for them to think about accessibility work while they're doing the project. Documentation about testing or sort of best practices, things like that. And I've made materials available that hopefully they can use kind of whenever it's the right time for them to find those things, versus things like, reviewing wireframes or mockups or that kind of like daily accessibility kind of review work is stuff I don't really do. But I'm trying to enable people to do that stuff. So that might change over time depending on kind of how our program changes and grows. But at the moment, I'm really doing that kind of higher level org-wide thinking stuff, and not so much like, for this exact product, this is the decision we need to make this thing accessible. It's much more abstract, for better or worse.
That makes sense. And so as you're working with different people and really, taking this program forward, almost going on your analogy of, watering the plant, right? And so how do you change people's minds and hearts about accessibility?
it's really hard. It is not easy, and I do not have I do not have a good, nice, succinct answer for that. There's an article that goes around once in a while that's not about accessibility specifically. I think it was a Huffington Post article that's the title is something like, I don't know how I can convince you to care about other people or something like that. It's sort of like this idea that like there's a certain point at which like someone has to make the decision to care about other people. So I've kind of given up on trying to make people feel, because you can't make people feel things. And what I've tried to do instead is kind of have as many self-serve resources available as I can, and make it so that if either someone has a question, I can point them in the direction of a resource or give them some guidance on where to go next. But they kind of already have to be at that, like, I need to learn about this. Whether or not they want to or not is up to them, but they kind of already have to be at that point where they're willing to dive in and learn more. I feel like you can't, you burn up so much energy trying to make other people feel something. So like I go back and forth about, there's a lot of discussion about empathy in digital accessibility. And I have a very hard time with trying to make people feel empathetic, or whether empathy is the thing they should be feeling. Maybe they should be, I don't know what they should be feeling, but it's hard to make people feel things.
Okay. And so, like, a lot of times I've heard, the whole carrot versus the stick analogy, which kind of goes around sometimes with, how can you really make accessibility more about people and maybe a little less about standards and compliance? Not to say standards and compliance are not important. I feel like they're good guiding stones, right, in a way. But sometimes I think we lose track of the fact that this isn't a check mark, right? This isn't a actual, okay, you met the minimum compliance, you're good to go, right? This is actual people we are talking about. And so how do you really make accessibility more about the people?
So I just looked up, because I couldn't remember what this paper was called. I just read this research paper from 2015 or 2014 rather. I'll send you a link to it later. It's called Web Accessibility and Disability, Developing Critical Perspectives on Accessibility, and it's by Sarah Luthwaite. And it is about the idea that the fact that we've created laws based on standards makes those standards, that kind of cements them, when all of those digital technical standards are written to be squishy, because there is no sort of good universal model for everything. So this is something I've been thinking about a lot, because often organizations come to accessibility work because of the stick. They get sued, or there's some other legal concern. And so trying to steer people away from that, like, oh, we did everything, checkbox, we're done forever way of thinking, I think really requires organizational change. Just that's all. And
that's
really,
it. So simple.
Really, just really placing emphasis on doing usability testing, and not just hiring people with disabilities in accessibility teams, but just across the board, in every department, every role. So I think it's really up to rethinking. I think it's tied up in including disability as part of diversity, and really changing the way an entire organization thinks about disability, to make it a usability concern that can introduce barriers to people, instead of a kind of checklist. Yeah. So,
for sure.
I think there's a way forward. I don't think it's easy.
No, I completely agree. And so, thinking about all the people who are in this field, and thinking about experts, right, who we share knowledge, gain knowledge from, what does an expert in accessibility mean to you? How would you define an expert in accessibility?
I have a hard time with the word expert, because it's definitely something that, so I think I don't like to say I'm an expert in accessibility because of how sort of I keep using the word squishy, but how people and user focused it is, and how very dependent it is on different things. So like, for example, I know a lot about web accessibility. I know a little bit less about mobile. I know very little about desktop apps and things like VR. So I feel like you can kind of specialize in different areas, and can specialize, say, in like education, or specialize in implementation. But I think it's very difficult to say that you're an expert in this whole concept.
I'm with you on that.
Okay. I mean, I do like to point to the expertise of disabled people talking about experiences that they have. As far as like what is expertise in the field, but I try to steer away from saying that I'm an accessibility expert, or that people can be accessibility experts. I feel like it's like saying I'm a design expert or a development expert. Like, you don't usually say that, because you say that you're a specialist, or you say that you're a practitioner of some sort.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Makes sense. And so, what advice would you give to others who are thinking about becoming more involved, or just jumping, into digital accessibility?
Get ready to learn forever, because there's stuff changing all the time. Get comfortable with getting political, because it's a political topic, for better or for worse. I think it's very difficult to do accessibility work and not in some way, have that impact the way you think about politics and social issues and everything. And get comfortable with saying it depends. I say it depends a lot. I don't say it as much as I used to, because again, I'm not doing a lot of like in the weeds work anymore. But when people come to you and say like, is this going to be accessible? It's almost always very difficult to give a yes or no. There's always ifs or clarifications needed, or there's always a bunch of caveats.
Makes sense.
Which I know can be frustrating sometimes if you're working with an accessibility specialist and they won't give you a straight answer, but it's because they don't feel comfortable giving you a straight answer, because it's not easy. So yeah, basically a lot of being comfortable with ambiguity, I think, is a strength, which is stressful sometimes, but important.
Be careful with ambiguity. I like that.
Yeah.
I like that. And so, as a parting question, something a little bit more actionable, what is one thing you could tell someone that they could do immediately in the short term to achieve accessibility in their day-to-day work? I mean, something as simple as, reminding people to, hey, there's something called an alt text function that, shows up on most apps. So if you're adding pictures, make sure you add alt text. Are there other things, like, is there one thing that you could tell someone who's watching this to go do today?
Test with the keyboard. Jeebus, test with the keyboard. It's like the easiest thing, but people don't know how, they don't know how controls are supposed to work with the keyboard if you've never done it. So that is a thing I always spend time on in workshops when I'm teaching. It's a thing I always talk about ad nauseum, is because you're going to find a lot of things you've done wrong if you can't use the keyboard with anything you're building. So yeah, test with the keyboard.
I love that. Thank you. Thank you so much.